This hour on i24 News, in Syria, the regime airstrikes are intensifying and the civilian misery in a rebel enclave is growing. The United Nations is calling for a humanitarian ceasefire.
And a powerful earthquake hits Taiwan. At least 2 people were killed, and rescuers are trying to free people still trapped in collapsed buildings.
And Poland has signed a controversial bill making it a crime to blame that nation for crimes committed by the Nazis.
From the i24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Shayna Estulin.
The images coming in from Syria on this day have been horrifying. Syrian and Russian warplanes just intensified their airstrikes on a rebel stronghold near Damascus.
And workers on the ground say at least 55 people, including children, have been killed. The UN is calling for a ceasefire so humanitarian aid can get in. Our correspondent Marcus White has the latest.
This video shows Syrians near Damascus trying to make their way through heavy dust, searching for people, including children, after airstrikes intensified in the area. The bloodshed here follows airstrikes on Monday by the Syrian government, which claimed the lives of at least 30 people in eastern Ghouta. Apart from those bombings, UN war crimes experts say they're investigating reports of bombs allegedly containing chlorine gas used against people in Sarakeb in the northwest province of Idlib and Doma, northeast of Damascus. The Syrian government continues to deny using chemical weapons. The UN is calling for the fighting to come to an end so aid can be delivered to those in need and the injured can be evacuated. The UN said Tuesday not a single aid delivery had been made over the last 2 months. Syrians in the war zone say they feel no place is safe and that the bombings seem endless. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, with the support of the Russian Air Force and Iranian-backed militias, are continuing a relentless military campaign to rid western Syria of insurgents. The head of the International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, Paulo Pinheiro, says the government fighting in eastern Ghouta illustrates the international crimes of indiscriminate bombardment and deliberate starvation of the civilian population and make a mockery of so-called de-escalation zones. In September, Russia, Turkey, and Iran agreed to establish de-escalation zones in Syria for 6 months, but that has not stopped the fighting there. The airstrikes Tuesday followed Syrian rebels downing a Russian plane and killing a pilot over the weekend. In response, Russia stepped up airstrikes on Idlib. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or displaced during the war in Syria, which will soon enter its 8th year with no end in sight. Marcus White, i24 News.
Just incredible footage coming out of Syria.
Yeah.
All right, let's bring in our senior diplomatic correspondent, Nina Larson. Nina, the UN is calling for a ceasefire. Any chance that actually happens?
Well, very slim at the moment, Shayna, and we've seen how these calls for ceasefires to let humanitarian aid in have gone before, and these so-called de-escalation zones. The UN officials that were speaking to the press from Damascus today, their UN mission is still functioning there, were very, very clear. They said, look, these de-escalation zones are escalation zones now. You've got people crammed into Idlib, thousands displaced, and they're in these enclaves that are suffering terrible bombardment from the air, from the Syrian and in some cases the Russian Air Force.
Nina, the U.S. policymakers and lawmakers on Capitol Hill were briefed on this day by the last U.S. ambassador to Syria. What happened?
Yes, this is Ambassador Robert Ford, and this is someone really to take notice of. He was the last U.S. ambassador in Damascus. He was forced to leave in 2011 when the embassy closed down. But he was very hands-on when he was in Syria. He's an absolute expert. He used to go out into the streets. He used to meet opposition figures. And but he was very, very critical of current U.S. policy and the peace talks in Geneva.
Having worked on this for 4 years, long years, the Geneva process is dead. It's moribund at best. And Geneva cannot be some kind of a diplomatic strategy. It's going nowhere.
Well, the last ambassador to Damascus there, Robert Ford, explaining that the U.S. really doesn't have much leverage in these peace talks because this is an all-out war and the U.S. is not a player on the ground. The players, of course, are Russia and Iran and now Turkey, David.
Nina, there was a chemical attack over the weekend. Is the UN looking into that, and can they do anything about it?
Yes, well, it's absolute deadlock here at the United Nations. There was an emergency session yesterday morning immediately after that alleged attack on Sunday. This was an attack employing chlorine gas. That's banned under international law. It's a very lethal chemical agent, Shayna. But there's really nothing much the UN can do at the moment. They have tried again and again to implement this investigative team that they had on the ground. But again and again, the Russians have vetoed any efforts at this, any efforts at accountability. The Security Council yesterday couldn't even issue a joint statement. Russia blocked that as well. And this was another interesting point from this hearing on Capitol Hill. The former ambassador saying that there must be some kind of concrete deterrence to the Assad regime, and the only deterrence he could see that they would possibly pay any attention to is a U.S. military one in Syria. Shayna and David.
Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent reporting from the United Nations. Nina, thank you. Let's bring in John Sitilides. He's a geopolitical strategist for Trilogy Advisors. And John, in terms of the Syrians and their backers, the Russians, what are they up to? What is their strategy right now in terms of why intensify the airstrikes against this rebel-held area and why use chlorine gas?
It seems it's pretty self-evident. This is a pitiless military campaign against any type of opposition to the Assad regime primarily, and from the Russian perspective, any potential threat to their new naval and air assets on the Syrian coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Remember that Russia just signed 49-year leases to project power from the Mediterranean Sea, Syrian territory. It intends to protect those assets and to help Assad defeat any possible threat to the regime in Damascus or to Russia's military.
Now, some of those rebels are connected to al-Qaeda. Some of them are Islamists, but it does seem like Syria is targeting hospitals, civilians, women, children. Why?
It's been a very effective campaign from a purely military perspective for the Damascus regime, that of Hafez Assad, to terrorize his population and to terrorize anyone who's thinking of providing any type of comfort, any type of succor to the terrorists, the Islamists, anyone that is working against the regime. This is not the kind of theater that can be resolved with UN resolutions or the quote-unquote international community. Unfortunately, that Geneva process was dead before it ever began, and this is going to be a ruthless military campaign, and unfortunately it seems it'll only end when the Russians, with Assad and with the Iranian government, decide that they are victorious.
Well, is there any, to that point, is there any indication that the rebel groups that are getting bombarded, that they at a certain point might say, okay, enough, let's try to work out some sort of surrender?
They might. That all depends on what kind of resources they have, what kind of willpower they have to resist this kind of, again, pitiless military bombardment. And that remains an open question. We'll see what happens in the months and years ahead. The U.S. itself has very little leverage here in the western part of Syria. That's utterly dominated by the Russian Air Force in the sky and Hezbollah proxies of the Iranian government on the ground backing the Assad regime. And the U.S. primarily is focused now on rooting out the last remnants of Islamic State in eastern Syria. If there is going to be any type of a U.S. strike to try to punish Assad for the use of chemical weapons, it would have to be in carefully selected areas near Damascus where there are few, if any, Russian forces.
John Sitilides, a geopolitical strategist for Trilogy Advisors. John, thank you. What do you make of all of this?
Well, as John said, as the ambassador, the former ambassador to Syria said, the U.S. has no leverage here. So the U.S. can say, we don't want Assad, we want no more chemical attacks. But if they have no foot in this game, if they're not there on the ground, then it's just a pipe dream.
And it also raises the question, I mean, what does Assad gain out of this? He's already winning, essentially. He's going to hold on to power. Nobody doubts that. What does he gain by killing so many innocent people? And again, they've already got military superiority over this general part of Syria.
I think it goes to what's going on in his mind. He is clearly not a good person if he's going after innocent women and children. But as John also pointed out, he doesn't want them to give any food or aid to these rebels. but they're innocent people, and he's attacking them with chemicals. It's evil.
Right.
I think it's fair to say it's evil.
Right.
All right, we turn now to a significant earthquake on this day in Taiwan. It measured 6.4 on the Richter scale. It toppled buildings, scattered debris, and it damaged roads.
Rescuers are still on the scene of a hotel that caved in and fell to the side. Authorities say at least 2 hotel employees were killed. Crews are still working to free other people who may be trapped inside.
The earthquake also knocked out power to nearly 2,000 homes on the island.
Still ahead, Poland's president has defied the international community and is moving forward with a controversial law that shields the country from any blame for the Holocaust.
And in the Middle East, hundreds of Israelis turned out today for the funeral of a man who was stabbed to death in a terrorist attack. The suspect is still on the run.